deal with various financial crises. We see here, as we speak about finance, the president of the World Bank coming up to greet Deputy President Mashatile. So the issues of finance, particularly debt servicing, cost of capital, and tax reform. And then there's been an emphasis also on these new developments that we are seeing in the economy. So digitalization, AI, including Africa within the digital economy in a much more inclusive way. We've seen issues of trade come up, and really the G20 in the last few years has played an increasing role in the coordination of international trade discussions, as we've seen the WTO increasingly weakened in its ability to be a coordinator of global trade, and all sorts of initiatives being taken, particularly by the rich world. We've seen that acutely this year with President Trump's tariffs, which have basically annihilated the concept of most favored nation status, which is the idea that you treat all states equally in trade and as trade partners. And President Trump basically put a sledgehammer to that this year with his tariffs, and everybody, looking to play nicely with the United States in order to minimize the effect of tariffs on their economies. And so the G20 is becoming a really important platform for global trade as well.
And of course, Leanne, please feel free, but I want to get down to the real issues here. It has to go beyond just the rhetoric. So when we talk about beneficiation, for example, again, this is a word that has been a buzz phrase in our local politics for a long time. And now we're hearing it at the multilateral fora as well. But in terms of, take South Africa, and I was making this point with Sherwin, 80% of the world's known ferrochrome metals are found in South Africa. How do we then, as a nation, benefit from that going forward with regard to this critical minerals issue? Because the investments need to be made. Who's going to make the investments? Business say they are ready. But how do we make sure that beyond on Monday, when the world leaders leave, how are we going to hold their feet to the fire to say, okay, let's see whether you are walking the talk?
Look, I think that one of the things we need to understand about how the G20 works is that this continuity from presidency to presidency of these working groups, where something will come up as a germ of an idea, and I always use climate finance as an example of this, where in 2012, when the working group on climate finance was established with South Africa and France as the co-chairs of it, it was anathema. It was completely weird that you would have the issue of climate finance on the agenda at the G20, because a number of countries said that that's a UNFCCC issue, it's a COP issue, it doesn't belong here. And then over time, through sustained continuous work on this over the years, you've seen frameworks being developed around how do you finance climate change mitigation and adaptation, how do you compensate states who are feeling the brunt of climate change currently, but weren't the contributors to the problem and to carbon emissions, into global warming initially. All of those ideas that started off as something that was considered very strange and not belonging within discussion in multilateral fora has been established and socialized within the G20 process through very careful and steady diplomacy over time. And I think this is where the importance of the engagement groups comes in, because the B20, the T20, so having all of business here, having banks here, private banks here, because although we talk and we focus on the development banks as important sources of capital, actually so much of the capital that is being borrowed from private lending institutions these days. And so having them in the room to say, well, if these are all of the commitments that you claim to be committed to and that you agree need to happen, how do we then put that down into actionable policy, actionable strategy going forward? And I think that is what needs to keep being watched over time beyond just the summit. So, the summit lends itself to lots of pomp and ceremony, and we can broadcast it on TV, and we're seeing all the important people walk in. But that's not where the work is done.
But
the work follows.
That's down to us to make sure that it is more than the pomp pomp and ceremony.
Yeah.
We can't be spending all this money just for pomp and ceremony.
Yeah.
South Africa, the world needs to benefit from it.
Yeah.
Indeed, and South Africa has played a very big role over the years in ensuring that the interests of the continent and the interests of South Africa are represented in G20 discussions. And I think that we downplay that very much as a country. But if you consider in 2020, when a lot of Africans say the global economy shut down, a lot of African states were facing a huge amount of debt servicing that they needed to do. And it was South Africa that advocated for there to be debt pauses in payments. And that's an active, hugely effective intervention that was made.
The arrival of the WTO,
Is it?
Nkelemene.
no.
Is that not?
That's Ngozi Iweala, the head of the WTO.
Yes.
Is it the head of the
World
WTO?
Trade Organization
Yeah.
in Geneva, the organization that is part of the UN agencies that deals with issues of trade. When you talk about tariffs, she is the one who's really feeling the pinch, because there's now an intention by the United States of America not to follow the WTO to engage on trade.
Would that be Dr. Ngozi Okonjo
Yes.
Iweala? Okay, so just to let the viewers know, we're watching these visuals as much as we possibly can to try and see,
as much as we can.
trying to see who's walking up. So please forgive us as much as we are trying. We are not necessarily getting the greatest view. So just to keep you in the picture, we are obviously relying on the visuals that you're seeing on your screen, but on very small monitors in front of us. But that, of course, is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. And we've seen so many different people. If you've just tuned in, we've seen very high profile entrants so far, but these are the organizations that are represented there. Right in the beginning, we had Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who of course is the Director General of the World Health Organization. He came through. We saw the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva. She also made her way up. We saw the likes of many more. Ms. Dilma Rousseff, of course, the former president of Brazil, and now the president of the New Development Bank. So there have been incredibly high-profile people that have arrived already. They continue to do so, and we certainly will continue to bring these to you. I mean, this again stamping the weight of the G20. You know, the presence of these organizations here, as you say, Sakina, that's one thing. But it's what actually comes out in terms of the declaration and what is committed to helping. First time on the continent, first time we're seeing so much attention on Africa here, but it's how we benefit and how we take that forward. And that's why there's so much weight right now on this.
Indeed, and there are 19 international organizations that are regular members and participants of that are regular participants in the G20 process. So we've seen the heads of those 19, some of them come up. So the heads of the WHO, WTO, Dr. Ngozi that we've just seen. We've seen the head of the New Development Bank and others, the head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank that have come through. And then there is, of course, there are 5 regional organizations that are also invited in this G20. And so as the African G20, so we'll see the heads of SADC, ECOWAS, ECAS, COMESA, and EAC as well that are also here. And that have been invited by South Africa because this is an African G20.
But there is still a feeling, Sophie, that Africa is underrepresented.
Yeah. Well, the SG yesterday, the UN Secretary General did emphasize that after 1948, the formation of the United Nations, transformation from the League of Nations that failed to maintain the world peace. You had the UN, the intention to build the world peace, but also have all these different agencies and institutions to ensure that you have this peace. Now, Africa is not represented at all in strategic positions such as the UN Security Council, including IMF and World Bank. They are more geared towards benefiting the developed countries, because they were there when the peace was achieved after the Second World War, and those who won, or the victors, they did determine the way forward, looking at themselves as they were reconstructing their respective countries. Now, after so many years, you really have to re-look at that, because now you have many countries who are members of the United Nations, and they must have a voice, they must have a say. But the problem is the countries who were there at that time, who are even developed, the developed north, mostly in the Peace and Security Council, they are the ones who are the gatekeepers, because they are prolonging the transformation of the Security Council. Why are they not coming out clear to say we now agreeing on the time frame that on such a date the South America and Africa will be represented in the Security Council? You have Europe with many countries in the Security Council. Why?
But don't we need an overall reform? Because we need to change the framework, because we have moved way beyond what the world was in 1948. So we can't continue as if we are still stuck there.
Yeah, and when you think of the San Francisco conference where the UN was established, it was 1945. There were only 50 countries that were at the San Francisco conference in 1945, and that is a third. That's now not even. It's about a quarter of the UN's membership. There are now over 193 countries that are members of the UN, and because the majority of the world was under colonial occupation in 1945. Of those 50 states that were at the San Francisco conference, only 4 were African: Egypt, Liberia, South Africa and Ethiopia. And so the world has changed profoundly since 1945, and yet you've got the UN Security Council in particular that represents the a frozen version of the balance of power in 1945. So the 5 permanent member states, Russia, China, the United States, the United Kingdom and France, that were really the victors of the Second World War. And you've seen over time the tension that comes from the exclusion of Africa was excluded systematically because the majority of all African states were under colonial rule. Latin America is underrepresented in the UN, is not represented amongst the 5, but also is underrepresented amongst the 10 not elected members, so the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. And so a lot of the discussion this year, it being the 80th anniversary of the UN, has been around UN reform and UN Security Council reform, particularly around expanding the UN Security Council, but also providing more powers to those parts of the Security Council that of the UN rather, that have general membership. So, giving the UN General Assembly more powers than it currently has, that are allowed for in the UN Charter, and changing the practices of the UN to make its decision-making far more democratic, and avoiding the situation that we currently have, where the 5 permanent veto members of the UN Security Council have a huge amount of control over the decision-making of the UN.
I mean, if I may just jump in here, because that's an important aspect of what we're seeing unfolding here. You've got the US dominating the IMF, they dominate the World Bank, they dominate the UN, the Security Council, I beg your pardon, and there's still, of course, the whole issue of veto power, which you alluded to. But we are seeing the absence of the US in this right now. And, perhaps that this is the moment where perhaps things start changing and discussions in the trajectory of this, and we see a new power in the G20, because there is no veto power in this. But perhaps you want to talk to that, because this is a shift in power with the US being absent in all of this.
Well, so much has been made of what does it mean to not have the US here? What does it mean for the legitimacy of the decisions that are made? If you can't reach consensus, G20 decisions since it was first established with the finance ministers in 1998, but then also with the leaders meeting from 2008, the decisions of the G20 have been made by consensus. So the leaders' declaration that we're anticipating. And so what does it mean when you don't have that kind of consensus, because the most powerful state in the world is not involved in the decisions that are being made? And I think that what we've seen from the rest of the world is an affirmation of the importance of this kind of diplomacy, and this kind of, the G20, I've seen it described as a kind of a mini-lateralism, because we know that there are only 21 members now of the G20, with the African Union being part of it, but they still do represent a huge amount of the global economy and global trade, but also a huge chunk of the global population. And so to see states coming to be part of this process, there's lots of bilateral meetings that are going to be taking place. The IBSA is going to be meeting, the AU met yesterday. I think reaffirms the legitimacy of the process of multilateralism, regardless of how big you are or how small you are, how important it is to just be in the process of diplomatic engagement, and that you can't, in the current climate, deal with any of the big challenges that we're facing in the world on your own as a state.
However, it all comes down to money, doesn't it? Look at what happened to us now with the trade wars. Look at what happened to South Africa as an example when the PEPFAR funding was removed, and the repercussions that had for the rest of the world. And similarly with the United Nations. And when the US stamps its authority, it does so on the back of the dollar that they are putting into all of these establishments. So how do we navigate that, Sophie?
Well, I think, for example, in a situation like South Africa, to have the AU as a member of the G20, you already have a muscle, because when you look at the population of the continent, 1.4 billion, you are much stronger. And that is why there's always been a push to ensure that African countries work together. We saw the arrival of Wamkele Mene earlier on, who is leading the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is trying to bring together African countries to do trade amongst themselves. Because in a situation like this, where the US is so unpredictable, if we had earlier years ensured that African countries are doing business amongst themselves, that could have been a cushion. And therefore, that not only politically but also economically, but also bring in other friends who are willing to assist. And then you also push for transformation of these important institutions whose responsibility is to help with development. So you have to continue to fight. The fight must continue to try and ensure that you have a just world, not only politically or security, but also economically.
Okay, so the plane that's just touched down now, not a moment too soon, because they have made it just in time to arrive here in South Africa. It's the German delegation that's just landed there. You can see on your screen right now. I'm thinking it must be the German Chancellor, but we don't have too firm confirmation at this moment. We will in a moment hear who is on that plane, but if it is the German Chancellor, it's Friedrich Merz. He, of course, has confirmed his attendance here, so we should see in a moment him arriving out there. So also still the red carpet is taking place, and you can see the delegates and the invited guests and VIPs arriving, representing organizations, banks, you name it, from regional to international organizations that have been making their way through.
I think the announcement, but these delegations, when you look at representatives, they continuously have different names.
Yeah.
we were told that it will be the Vice Chancellor. I'm not so sure whether it's still what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But we saw earlier on also changes. The president of Nigeria was supposed to come, but it's now the vice president. Because of the challenges of security in his country, we saw him changing the military hierarchy. And therefore, at times you want to come, but towards the meeting, you then have a problem at home and you delegate someone to represent the country.
Yeah.
And we beg your indulgence in that regard, because we can only give you what we have.
Absolutely.
And the official information that we have also is changing as we go along.
Yeah.
And to the right of your split screen is, of course, where we are at NASREC, I think, and this is the arrival of delegates.
I think it's the start of the arrival of invited guests, who will be, some of them, heads of state and government from different countries, particularly SADC, the region. The picture is not very clear. I suspect
but it seems like
it's the Namibian,
president.
Who is arriving. Yes, it's the Namibian president, Nandi Ndaitwah.
And watch the gate, which is why I thought it was her earlier. Can you see how similar it is? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you see it? Yeah.
But this is what you're watching right now, as we say, the invited guests arriving. The Namibian president, newly newly elected, which is and coming in there with
first
absolute
female
power.
president.
Yeah.
A diplomat, a foreign affairs minister, a veteran activist with SWAPO. When I spoke to her, just before the inauguration, he was clear on multilateralism, that Namibia will continue to support multilateralism.
Yeah, and women rising to the top in Namibia at the moment, holding some very key positions in that country, and starting from the top, of course, with the position of president. So those are the two screens that you are watching as the Namibian president is welcomed there by our very own Deputy President Paul Mashatile, and of course just watching that door of the aircraft that we have seen arrived. I can tell you they will make their way in time, because the roads will be closed.
They
will be
fine.
Straight through here to NASREC.
Absolutely.
They'll be fine.
Yeah, they will be fine. Well, listen, you stay tuned to SABC News. We'll continue to bring you this rolling coverage of all of the arrivals, the dignitaries, and we should in a moment also be seeing our president arriving and walking on that carpet along with our deputy president. So as we sort of start winding things up here and we hand over to Ayanda, who's out on the floor, he's going to be taking over from us, from myself, Sakina, and I think Dr. Mbete, you as well. We're going to depart our seats.
We leave them here. Dr. Mbete and Sophie, we
Are
leave
we leaving
here.
Dr. Mbete here? Okay.
I'm sure they have much more to do. The two of us, let's go try to catch up on some sleep.
Absolutely.
You think we're going to get any?
No, I don't think so, because we're going to be glued to these screens that I hope you are glued to as well, as we continue to see. And I'm hoping Ayanda gets this visual as well, where he is just seeing what it is that is coming out. And as you can see from that German delegation's arrival, there's a lot of action. We've seen this happen over and over again. It's the red carpet that's being carried to those stairs that's about to be rolled out, and you'll start seeing the delegation making their way. I never thought I'd be more familiar with this. I've never been this familiar with the arrival of dignitaries and the behind the scenes of that carpet, what happens. They then come and sweep it. And then
they roll it out, and now you know how they roll it out. You know, there's a process there. But I tell you what, that's it from us as they roll out the red carpet. And Ayanda Nyati, he's somewhere on the floor behind us. So let's hand it over to him. And of course, we will be giving you wall-to-wall coverage here as the host broadcaster. So Ayanda, if you can hear us, it's over to you.
You're coming through loud and clear. Sakina, Leanne, a sterling job. Thanks very much indeed. It brings us to 3 minutes after 9 o'clock Central African time as we continue with our rolling coverage of this moment in history, the G20 Summit held on African soil for the very first time. We'll continue beaming those live visuals to you from OR Tambo International Airport. That's where, as you can see, officials from the SANDF are still hard at work, rolling out the red carpet, quite literally, for the German delegation that's been led by Chancellor Joachim Friedrich Martin Merz. He is the 10th Chancellor of Germany at the age of 69, a country, of course, which has its own standing on the global stage, for lack of a better term. Of course, Germany, amongst some of the world powers, certainly a country which we're glad is well represented at this particular summit, alongside many other of the world's leaders. As you mentioned, you might not be able to see me, but I'm coming to you from a very vibrant floor of the media center, and let me tell you what, it is a world-class affair from the moment you arrive to, of course, all the equipment that's here. And I've been able to spot a few people that you know very well. Samkele Maseko is our senior reporter for the SABC News Channel. He's also here. And Samkele, before we get into, I suppose, the substance of what this G20 summit is about, I think it's worth just taking this in, you know? Here we are, this country on the tip of Africa, with the world gazing as, you know, the leaders, the who's who, start to arrive.
Indeed, and if you look at South Africa on the tip of the African continent, a powerhouse when it comes to international relations and shaking the global economic and political architecture, particularly noting some of the issues that the President of South Africa has been advocating for within this G20 presidency of South Africa, and ultimately his tenure during COVID-19. You remember him speaking in Paris in a forum held by French President Emmanuel Macron about the global financial architecture, how it is skewed against African countries, particularly on the advent of those COVID-19 vaccines, and how he felt at times that South Africa and Africa at large had to be seen and treated like beggars, wanting those particular vaccines, and the world just hogging all those particular vaccines for themselves and leaving Africa to essentially die within that particular period. And he's speaking about the global financial architecture at the time, working against the African continent seen as secondary citizens within the global population. And these are some of the issues that he's going to be ventilating, particularly in his opening address, when you speak about how the Global Inequality Report, South Africa's theme is inclusive growth, and it speaks about the developing global south as well. Just as you see the Chancellor of Germany arriving, it brings to mind Africa. It's got 4% global carbon emissions, but Africa has to bear the brunt of the just transition. Who's going to be funding that just transition? What is the modality of its implementation? How is it going to affect the reindustrialization of the African continent, particularly when you look at how African countries are trying to reindustrialize? You look at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition within South Africa, led by Minister Pakstau, led by the likes of Zukoko Limpik, trying to reindustrialize. You saw the UK yesterday with the Premier of Gauteng as well, looking at domestic issues, reindustrializing South Africa, looking into the rail and locomotive sector within the African continent, within South Africa in particular. So it's going to be rather interesting on some of the points President Ramaphosa, as the president of G20, is going to raise on the reindustrialization, the development of Africa, and the sticky issue, the just transition, and also the Global Fund as well is going to be a very topical issue, noting some of the donations that have been made, the donation by the United States of America yesterday. These are some of the issues that are going to be ventilated throughout this particular session, with the Sherpas having that draft resolution, that draft declaration that has already been done and dusted, and up to the G20 leaders now to discuss on that. But the critical issue is global finance and global debt. Global debt is a huge issue.
Yeah, absolutely. The international financial architecture is sometimes how they refer to it. There's no doubt that that will feature quite prominently as we're here. And by the way, I'm sure you're able to see me now. We're still keeping a close eye on the arrival of those delegations who are still touching down at OR Tambo International Airport. But simultaneously, there are more of the invited guests that are also walking into the Nasrec Expo Center, where essentially the business of the day is going to unfold. unfold over the next 2 days or so. And I suppose it's also worth pointing out to you that there are important issues that South Africa is certainly hoping to get over the line. As Samkele mentioned, issues around driving the interest of the Global South is certainly top of mind. Beneficiation around critical minerals. But yesterday we heard from the United Nations Secretary General also speaking about the need to finally do something to end the wars in different parts of the world. Gaza, Sudan, the DRC, and the list really goes on. Ukraine, for example, also certainly top of mind. And Samkele, I can't, for example, wait to see how, this particular gathering will try weave all of these crucial issues together when that declaration hopefully finally comes forward.
The declaration is going to be rather interesting, particularly noting how there is an increasing view, particularly by BRICS nations, by the developing Global South, that they are important players, particularly when you look at the population. A bulk of the world's population, majority of it, lies within the developing South. You look at the developed North, they're also facing some of their challenges. One of the sticky issues is this issue around just transition. I think it's one of the main issues that is going to be deliberated upon. You've seen, particularly on Africa, wanting to leverage on its minerals. If you look at the number of the tons and tons, thousands and thousands of tons of coal that are exported out of the Richards Bay Coal Terminal going into international markets, as the Chancellor of Germany arrives, Germany has restarted and kick-started its coal-powered stations, particularly after they were not receiving gas from Russia, when Russia cut those pipelines into some European countries. And that just tells you that there is a demand for coal. Yet, the just transition demands of South Africa to decarbonize, leave coal behind, but that is going to leave thousands and thousands of people unemployed in Mpumalanga. You go to the Komati power station, an issue that was ventilated in COP in Dubai, after the closure of that Komati power station, the destruction that was left to the people of Mpumalanga. You go to other countries that have spoken about new forms of energy. You go to the Inga Dam, where Africa's largest hydroelectric power station was meant to develop, but it is not yet done, which speaks to the issues of just transition and using your natural resources in order to generate electricity. It's going to be interesting when you find the Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, that has also come to this particular G20. You've got the UAE, which is a critical partner to South Africa as well, and other countries, particularly within the Gulf, that have an abundance of oil. Will they leave that oil behind to go to another natural resource that they have, which is sun? But their economies have been anchored around this particular resource and mineral that they have. Then you've got the United States of America through President Donald Trump, who was not here, who've just been saying, baby, we're going to drill, baby, drill. And those are some of the contentious issues that are essentially going to be ventilated here, which speaks to the economic question, which speaks to about eradicating inequality that is there and is growing globally.
Yeah, and of course, the big refrain for South Africa's G20 presidency is about leaving nobody behind. And I know that's a huge concern when it comes to this just energy transition. Activists on the ground raising serious concerns about what would happen to their communities if, in fact, this just transition happens without considering ways in which they'd be affected.
That's some of the issues, particularly when you look at the theme of this G20, inclusive growth, leaving no one behind. And it ultimately speaks to what is entailed in South Africa's founding a document of democracy, which is the Freedom Charter, that the people shall share in the country's mineral wealth. In this instance, I would say the people shall share in the globe's mineral wealth. And you don't find that, particularly if you look at the Global Inequality Report, you find that 86% of the countries globally have a high inequality rate, and there are discrepancies, particularly within incomes in homes. And that just tells you that these are some of the issues that have to be ventilated. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke about this particular issue yesterday, about inclusive growth and leaving no one behind, and particularly with the atrocities that are happening to the people of Palestine and Gaza. These are some of the issues that you find where humanitarian aid was blocked by some countries, particularly coming from the sea, to help those people of Gaza who are faced with those crimes against humanity perpetuated by the Israeli state of Benjamin Netanyahu, which are some of the issues as well that may find themselves in ending of the wars that are currently perpetuating themselves globally. You go just next door in South Africa, in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, there are issues particularly within that area which threatens the stability of the SADC region.
Absolutely. Each of these issues, Samkele, could have its own summit. So we'll have to leave it there for now. As you can see, we're spoiled for choice about which of these salient global issues of concern are likely in some ways to feature once that declaration, hopefully crossing fingers and everything in between, is in fact tabled here at the G20 Global Summit at Nasrec. We're live to you from the floor of the media center. But of course, the nerve of our broadcast is from our satellite studios. That's where we find our Tula Sizwe Simelane, Sharon Bryce Peace, and the rest of the team. And my, oh my, so much to speak about ahead of the President's opening address.
Right, thank you for that. That's Ayanda Nyati with Samgele Masego on the floor here at the Nasrec Expo Center. We really are at the business end of this session. South Africa's hosting of the G20 2025. Good morning. I'm Tula Sizwe Simelane.
And I'm Sherwin Bryce Pease. A pleasure to have you with us here on the host broadcaster of this all-important G20 Leaders Summit. This is the day we cross the T's and dot the I's. We make sure that security is a premium. The food is being served, not too salty. The diplomats are here. The media is here. And the world spotlight certainly on South Africa today. And make no mistake, South Africa is not new to hosting big events. The question is, does the success of this event translate into real changes to Lasizwa on the ground? We're talking not just about things, pies in the sky, right? We're talking about nuts and bolts issues, critical minerals that must beneficiate, that must make communities stronger economically, food security, climate justice, and very much a shift here from the G20 in terms of not just dealing with macroeconomic stability and market stability, because market stability doesn't mean you address poverty, right? And so we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so you've seen this crescendo that started in Indonesia, was taken on by India, then went to Brazil, and now South Africa is going to ice the cake today. And that icing is certainly going to be contained in the paragraphs of an outcome document we might see this weekend.
Absolutely, Shawan. And by the way, it is absolutely great to be with you. It's been such a long time since you and I have been in the same space. Sharon Bryce Peace, of course, heading up our office out in New York, coming down, part of the formidable infrastructure that we are deploying as SABC News. As Sharon and I are talking, we'll also be joined by Dr. Frank Lekaba from the Wits School of Governance to just put perspective to some of the issues that we're talking about. Sharon, as you and I are talking, there's the arrival of the it's either the Chancellor or the Vice Chancellor. Official communication says Vice Chancellor of Germany is the person who is arriving. And also at the same time, you've been seeing the delegates actually has arrived already in the country, and the logistics of ferrying people from various hotels across Johannesburg in synchronicity, in a controlled manner, tight security, corridors, entire corridors closed off to allow for the ease of movement of these delegates.
The ease of movement of the delegates and the irritation of citizens who don't have access to their malls like they do. You know, you have to find side routes to get to where you need to be, but that is the nature of the game. And just to speak to the arrival of Germany, whether it's the Vice Chancellor or the Chancellor, right? Sometimes people seek controversy. Is it not a head of government or a head of state? These people are very busy. And sometimes things crop up on the domestic level at the last minute. And so things change from time to time. And so it is not to impugn the importance of the G20 summit when a deputy chancellor or a crown prince, rather than the king or the sheikh or the whatever comes, they are represented at the highest level possible for this summit. Unlike the United States, that has sought to exclude itself from the deliberations here, will maybe show up, we understand, at a handover ceremony, which the South Africans haven't necessarily agreed to yet. But certainly not to diminish the importance. The Germany represented at the highest level for this summit. That is possible, one understands. And Germany, of course, one of the largest economy in Europe, and certainly will bring that economic might to bear in the discussions that are going to be ensuing in the days ahead.
So while you and I are watching on our screens, we're seeing also the arrivals of delegates at the actual venue. That's Hall 6 here at the Nasrec Expo Center. In focus, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Ronald Lamula, who is performing the task of welcoming various heads of state, heads of government, and heads of delegation that are arriving for this particular. And I think
that's the President of Equatorial Guinea, absolutely. I believe, right?
Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo, who arrived yesterday, making his way into the hall for that reception. Let's bring in Dr. Frank Lekaba, to just your initial take. Doc, good morning.
Good morning to us and good morning to the viewers at home.
Thank you for spending some time with us to try and unpack and make sense of everything that we will be seeing. So today really is the business end of South Africa's hosting of the G20 for this year. Talk to me about what your expectations are. There are a couple of reports that will be tabled today that speak to some of the issues that are at the heart of Africa's developmental agenda and trajectory.
No, talking of that, Tulas, it's where now we're really going to see how Africa is going to engage. It's from today's deliberations where we're going to really see what will be the real benefits. Will the Africa agenda top the whole G20 agenda, and will because look, among the academic circles, you're talking about we're almost at the demise of the global south and the global north. Because when you look at the challenges that we face, COVID-19, migration, and all of that, they affect all of us. And even the responses, are common. So we are going to get to a point where we say, in terms of inequality, just from the agenda and the discussions that will be unfolding today, we'll get a sense as to whether are we making a headway in terms of the agenda of Africa being taken seriously or not. Earlier on, we were talking with Peter, and I was telling him, from my own sense, we're in an epoch where Africa agenda has to really be elevated in real terms, in terms of beneficiation. As we talk of minerals, critical minerals, the beneficiation has to happen. This is the epoch. I don't think, Tulas, after this epoch that we are in now, will have a much more advantaged position as we do have now to be able to champion this Africa agenda, elevate it and all of that. Because as I was saying, the global south and the global north now, that geography, it will be defined by the realities. But in terms of politics, the realignment that is taking place globally and all of that is shifting. So as it shifts, we must make sure that we maximize from it, and the Africa agenda is at the top, and G20 is that platform.
But to expand on that, I think what's important is the level of commitment that is going to be required to implement these things. Right? You have the diplomats now that are working on an outcome document. We understand that 80% of what the Sherpas have done has kind of been agreed to, and so they're passing the football on to the leaders, where the 20% will have to be rubber stamped, and you put the wax on the envelope and you seal it that way. But implementation is often been where great ideas falter. And so we have this big development agenda in terms of the G20, but remember we have the actual SDG plan that was adopted by member states in 2015 that kind of says similar things. And what do we have, 10 years later, with 5 years until the deadline of 2030, 35% of the targets are implemented. Things around poverty, food security, quality healthcare, quality education, gender equity, water and sanitation, climate justice, the list goes on. Strong institutions, partnership. The blueprint has been there, and so what we do is we reconvene to discuss how we're going to implement the things that we've decided before. So this is not new subject matter. The question is, how are we going to do it, and what does the means of implementation look like? And the means of implementation is a money question. It is a finance question. It is about how countries that are under debt distress are going to be able to pay less on debt repayments and invest more in education. What does concessional financing look like? The cost of money. How much, when you get a loan, you pay an interest rate. What is the interest rate for a country that perhaps cannot ill afford 10%, and maybe it should be 2%. And so these are very tricky discussions. You need a rejigging of how development banks operate. Maybe we need more development banks. We've had the BRICS Bank, Development Bank emerge over the last decade. And the question is, how is the private sector going to undergird what the public sector is seeking to achieve here? And so we have to walk hand in hand the role of civil society, the inclusivity that you've seen from South Africa in the summit. The G100 summit apparently is what some countries are calling it. But it is that hand-in-glove approach that is required here. Civil society and the media have to hold the politicians and the private sector accountable. You've made this decision. How are you going to implement it? You're not where you need to do. And so it's complicated. We have to be dedicated to the cause.
And all of those issues that you're highlighting, Shawan, will come to the fore, certainly during one of the sessions a bit later on today. That pomp and fanfare of the opening ceremony, which will be an open session to be addressed by the president of the G20, President Cyril Ramaphosa. And then a bit later on, you will have the closed sessions. They will include the delivery of the Africa expert panel. That talks to some of the issues we are talking about, where it's quite easy to say we need to invest more and put more capital into institutions such as the Africa Development Bank, for example. As we see the Vice President of Zimbabwe arriving there, Constantino Chiwenga, making his way. That's the level of representation from Zimbabwe. Of course, this talks to the number of countries that are not necessarily G20 members, but actually have been invited because of the agenda itself.
Tulas, sorry, Shewen. Shewen is speaking about the global agenda, sustainable development, its implementation, and where we are now as a world. But also added to it, as the continent, I think we also have to think about the pact for the future. How have we participated in the pact for the future?
Yes.
And how is that pact for the future aligned with our Agenda 2060? That is one thing. The other thing that I wanted to also, as a point of reflection, when you talk of debt, debt has been on the table for so many years. NEPAD, you remember with NEPAD, President Mbeki, they spoke about debt as they were going to G7 and all of that. G20 gives us a different platform because it's here now where we have a latitude to present our agenda. We have set the agenda. We said inequality, inclusivity, and sustainability. How are we getting it rolled out? So the issues of, among other things, the financing. Among other things, I was talking to colleagues yesterday on one of the shows, and I was stressing the issue of triple Ps. That is, it doesn't work for states to roll out infrastructure, invest in infrastructure and all of that, and compromise social responsibilities such as education, health, and all of that, and then private sector just benefits out of that, without. So that's where now, among other things, the role of triple Ps comes in, business, the role of business, business 20. So those are the issues now where we're gonna see in the statement how the business 20 also is going to be featured in all of that.
But the G20 will not achieve its goals if the Security Council doesn't achieve its goals. How do you implement development when there's conflict? The Secretary General and I discussed yesterday the $2.7 trillion annually that is going on military spending. So that we can fight and kill each other. So do we realign that financing, that flow of money towards maybe...
And importantly, the EU being a part of the G20, that's the big conversation, isn't it, in Europe now, upping their spend on defense as a percentage of GDP.
Because they feel threatened by Russia, because the Security Council is unable to do its job because its formation allows Russia to veto what was broad consensus. I was at the Security Council when 14 members voted to end the war, right? And Russia vetoed. So one country stands in the way of broad consensus. How is that right in 2025? How can that be how we go? And so we have to reform multiple institutions so the vision can be implemented. It's not just, the economic, let's have an economic discussion in a silo, and then let's talk about geopolitics and peace and security in another silo. There's an interlinkage here, and that's why I think what the G20 is trying to do, since the developing South has taken over the presidency, is to include development in the broader economic question, right? The issues of poverty, food security, gender equity, and so that's how you move forward. But we've got to address conflicts.
So we're seeing there, Sherwin, if I can just jump in, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, just arriving at the hall, at the venue itself. Just thought I'd just jump in as we make that, while we talk about what's on the agenda.
No, and let's talk about Jamaica, right? It's a small island state in the Caribbean. Why are small island states so important in a conversation about climate justice? Prof, do you want to go? Because their land mass is sinking into a rising ocean, and these people are really under threat. So,
Talking of transformation of global institutions, it was a priority in the Brazil G20, right? It was part of the key priorities of Brazil, the G20 under Brazil's presidency. I think it was priority number 3, global governance. I don't know, I've been looking at our priorities now and the discussions that started since we took over. In terms of that agenda of transforming global governance institutions, the World Trade Organization, we know the former finance minister of Nigeria is there at the WTO.
Dr. Ngozi.
Yes. How we then, what will be the conversation as we talk about all of this, the transformation of that global institutions, Shawan, I think is also going to be a very important agenda item.
Yeah, we're seeing on the screen there the arrival of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, being welcomed by, that's the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, who's now taken center stage. So it's all hands on deck.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think the president is exhausted.
Yeah.
He is giving one speech after closing the social summit, closing the business summit.
Yeah.
Lots of hands to shake. Lots of protocol at the airports, at the various airports. I've just been fascinated by who receives who at what level, because there's also that issue of protocol. So you're seeing now the Deputy President just welcoming a few moments ago the Prime Minister of Malaysia at the venue of the summit. You were talking, Shawan, about countries like Jamaica, and the discussion you were raising was about the issues around climate justice. And the whole issue of climate change is not theoretical for them. It's lived reality. And so one of the discussions that will come up a bit later on, disaster risk reduction, is a particularly relevant conversation for them. They will have a stake in it. They will have an interest in how that discussion is advanced.
And also understand the obstacles that these countries are going to have to overcome. There is a superpower that is disavowing that climate change is real.
Yeah.
Well, let me say it a different way. There is a president of a superpower, an administration of a superpower. That is because, Gavin Newsom, the California governor, the fifth largest economy in the world, was at COP30 disavowing what the president of the United States was doing. But understand the complication you now face, right? You have these countries desperate for away from fossil fuels because the science is very clear that the carbon emissions, the level of carbon dioxide, CO2 levels in the atmosphere is at such a peak level that the temperature, the Earth's temperature is rising above 1.5 degrees, which means we are headed for climate catastrophe. That's what disaster risk reduction is about. It's again a financial question to us.
Yeah. Shawan, we're seeing on our screens there the arrival of the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is arriving at the hall here yesterday, taking part in the Global Fund replenishment. There's a subtle message of reaffirming the partnership of certain countries in the wake of all these other discussions that you are raising, Shawan, about disavowing the rules-based order, but also issues of partnership and solidarity. But you are seeing countries such as the UK stepping forward, countries in the EU, Doc, that are saying we remain partners not only of South Africa, but of the African continent. Keir Starmer yesterday was part of that in terms of the Global Fund, that global health solidarity and funding from which the United States started pulling back a bit earlier on in the year.
Tulas, you are talking a very important point of realignment. Realignment in real terms and realignment at the level we don't see it very well. And you are talking of the EU, the UK. But what's interesting for me is France. You look at how Macron convened some leaders who were interested in the question of Palestine and saying what should be the position of other leaders on the question of Palestine. A few years back, we remember President Ramaphosa was there in Paris. They were talking issues of financing and all of that. And building up to this summit, Macron came out clearly that we are going to South Africa, we are going to agree with the declaration and all of that. So that role is very important of the realignment.
Yeah. We're seeing Mark Carney, the recently elected Prime Minister of Canada, also making his arrival. Shawan?
Let's link realignment to who's walking that red carpet. Let me try and make a link for you, right? Who is arriving? And what does realignment look like and why? What is a common position of all these countries, all these leaders that are arriving? They've been at the receiving end of a reciprocal tariff from the United States, which they don't like. They didn't want it, but they're trying to find ways around it, negotiations, bilateral trade deals. But essentially, it has undermined the rules-based order in terms of how we trade, in terms of the rules of the WTO under Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And so what all Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, Malaysian Prime Minister, Cyril Ramaphosa, go through the list. they all have one thing in common. They don't like these tariffs. They recognize that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. That is why you are seeing a realignment. That is why you are seeing the posture of the EU Council and the EU Commission. You saw their press conference. They talk about how they believe in a rules-based trading order. They believe in Africa's future and its renewable trajectory. These are antithetical to what you hear from the United States. And remember, the EU as a bloc is a 20-something $trillion economy. If they work together, they can really have influence. You know, if they want to invest in the industrial military complex, they can do that. The question is, what else is going to suffer? And so don't underestimate the consensus you will find in a room around what America is doing in the world today and how you need to reposition yourself despite them. You know, they're like this iceberg that you need to circumvent in deep waters.
But as we make that point, and as important as it is, Sherwin, Doc, how important will it be for these leaders and all of us who are gathered here to ensure that, you know, the focus is on the agenda as set by those who are sitting around the table, as opposed to an inordinate focus on those who have decided not to be, specifically the United States of America? How do they avoid that the common denominator that Sherwin is talking to, the discomfort about the upending of the global order, the rules-based system, doesn't become an obsession, but rather you are able to ensure that your agenda proceeds?
No, I think, Thulasizwe, the discussion on the declaration, which has occupied the moment now, in fact, I want to believe what the US has done with regards to the declaration, their statements, has kind of opened up a much more space for a focus on the declaration by the member states that are coming to the G20 here. And I think, as you have heard, France was very open that will agree to the declaration, EU. So that alone is reassuring of the whole idea of realignment and the importance of the G20. And one of the things that is also now bringing to the fore is, this is not South Africa G20 Summit. This is the G20 Summit, and the G20 agenda should continue. And when you look at South Africa's agenda of the G20 from India to Brazil to now in South Africa, when you look at the theme and the focus areas of the issues, priorities may differ in terms of numbers, but the focus areas have always been inclusivity, sustainability, and global governance.
So we're looking at the visuals of the arrival of the president of Finland, and that is Alexander Stubb, who is arriving there and being received by Deputy President Paul Mashatile. Finland, interesting as well for their role in Europe, Sherwin.
Yes, and aren't they one of the newest NATO member states, playing an oversized role in terms of seeking peace in Ukraine? I think he's made a number of visits to the White House. This is, I think, is the Irish president, if I'm not wrong. If I'm not mistaken. Looks familiar. This is a very interesting affirmation of South Africa, despite what you hear from that North American country.
Let me tell you now, Sherwin, I'm going to be relying a lot on your facial recognition software, okay? Because mine is dysfunctional.
Well, I got one for you. I think it looks like Deputy President Paul Mashatile.
So at least we can have consensus on that.
Listen, there are a lot of leaders here, guys. So we're watching as you're watching. We have people in our ears saying, hey, this is who that is, and we're trying to give you the best information as it's incoming, but this is a fluid situation. We see them as they arrive on the red carpet, as you do. So if we fumble here, we certainly hope to correct it soon. This is certainly a wonderful moment for South Africa. It looks like things are going very, very smoothly here. And that matters. I mean, that matters. This is the first African G20, the first South African G20, and I think our disposition and our posture matters here. You know, we can't only perform well on the rugby field, we have to do it in the diplomatic arena as well.
So we're looking at the arrival of the Prime Minister of Vietnam, making his way to the G20 Leaders Summit venue. I don't know if I pronounce his name correctly. I would say Pham Minh Chinh. Is the Prime Minister of Vietnam, making his way to be received by Deputy President Paul Mashatile. President Ramaphosa recently led that tour of 3 Asian nations, and Vietnam was among them. Doc, how important are they in these conversations? Those that are part of the G20 and those that are not necessarily part of the G20.
Very important to us because, look, we've been talking about alternative markets from the US, particularly with regards to how do we contain the effects of the trade agreements from the US. So Vietnam is one of those countries that the president visited and said, can we open up your markets for our produce and all of that? Can you be an alternative market? So coming here, and the president was openly inviting them, all these 3 countries that he visited. So coming here is also reassuring that indeed we are getting new partners on board, we are getting those alternative markets, and the space is opening up. The space of trade is opening up. So coming to South Africa is also reassuring.
It's an absolutely brilliant point, right? This is not just a multilateral occasion. South Africa is going to be working the room on a bilateral level. All the ministers are here. And as you say, Doc, correctly, it's about opening new markets, finding new avenues for our products. And so inviting them to the G20 is probably to say, hey, in fact, come join us, but let's talk.
In fact, Sherwin, so important is that point that it's actually been worked into today's agenda. So there's a whole hour that is set aside for bilateral meetings.
There you go.
One assumes they have to do with the G20 agenda, but once you are in the room, nothing stops you from having other discussions that have to do with advancing mutual interests, as countries do.
Yeah, it's like us here, Tulas, where we are pulling you with the hand and say, hey, Tulas, this is Frank, this is Sherwin. So it's very important, that space, that period for them to reflect and say, I identify you, I see you, we spoke. We didn't follow up on the agreement we have. Can we set up a by-nation agreement, commission or summit or whatsoever? Can we have a bi-national meeting where we discuss? We reinvigorate some of the agreements we have signed before and all of that. Can we have another state visit? Can we follow up on this? And so it's going to be very interesting as to how South Africa follows through on all of these engagements.
So we're looking at Gibran Rakabuming Raka. Let me say that slowly. Gibran Rakabuming Raka, the Vice President of Indonesia, who arrived yesterday. He's one of the younger leaders, that are at this G20. Having been born in 1987, so he's about 38 years old or thereabouts.
38.
Yeah, so he's one of the younger leaders, and we were talking about him yesterday. Just this being his first big global stage for him to perform on that stage.
I want you both to sort of jump in here. I'm just sort of having a thought sitting here about the relationship with the United States and South Africa and the potential of losing some sort of market access in terms of the diplomatic posture you see right now. And then you see a Malaysia and an Indonesia and a Vietnam and all these smaller Asian, South Korea is going to be when you lose the behemoth, you got to go to multiple smaller countries to fill the gap in a way. And I think that is the long-term goal here that South Africa is playing. I'm not saying they're going to lose completely the access. I think there's a strong bilateral an interest on both sides in terms of continuing the U.S. relationship.
Minister,
but let's let's pause that thought, and I'll hand back to Lasizwe.
Yeah, so it's almost like the Troika now, the full Troika that you now see. That's President Ramaphosa, Deputy
Excellencies.
Paul Mashatile, and the International Relations and Cooperation Minister, Ronald Lamula. Did you see that starter? What was happening there?
What a beautiful moment, though. These 3 gentlemen have been at the helm of this process, and don't underestimate the political capital that has gone into making this event a success. South Africa certainly trying to put on a good show here, and the man at the center of it all, the one that was running his mouth, quote unquote, right, is now going to welcome heads of state and government. Abiy Ahmed, the Ethiopian Prime Minister. Abiy Ahmed.
And there are lots of opportunities, Doc, for African cooperation. Yesterday, the president was going to host a working dinner for the invited African heads of state and government. Ethiopia plays a critical role. Of course, it hosts the African Union, but also pivotal in this conversation about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Of course, Tulas. In fact, Ethiopia is changing its foreign policy posture. They are redrafting their foreign policy under Abiy Ahmed, and their focus is a little bit much more changing.
Yeah.
The role Ethiopia has been playing in the region, that history of destabilization because of security in the region.
They're hitting us thick and fast.
Let's go.
Unfortunately, there's not much to talk about. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil. What an important partner for South Africa.
What an important partner. He's currently the president of BRICS, I believe. He's the president of the COP30,
Which is happening right
they're also
now,
trying to get to an outcome document.
Yes.
I think they might be pretty much where we are here in terms of the G20 outcome document. He has also been in the bad books of President Donald Trump. Yeah. He has stood firm and sought a more respectful tone from the president. Of course, former President Jair Bolsonaro, a close ally of the US incumbent.
Even the greeting, look at it.
Yeah, oh no, this is a hug fest. This is a hug fest.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It says a lot as well, Shaun and Doc. I imagine that he's busy. He's not someone who doesn't have anything to do. As you say, COP30 happening in his country as we speak. But he took the time to come out here.
Look, we place much more focus on, when you talk BRICS, we place much more focus on China, the leadership of China. But Brazil, India, coming to this summit gives South Africa that weight, gives South Africa's G20 presidency that weight that the global south is really behind.
We're looking at Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, the AU Commission chairperson, also making his arrival important in the sense of having been added to the G20 as a country bloc in 2023.
Their first participation as a fully fledged member of the G20 in Africa. So certainly a great deal of importance. He was also recently at the United Nations. They have this annual UN AU Commission Secretariat bilateral at the UN. And I asked him about the absence of the United States, and he said that it was very disappointing that they would not be here, but that this was Africa's time, this was Africa's G20, and it was important to come up with a product that is going to benefit Africa. And he was talking about how we need to put our demands on the table, and some people didn't like the word demands, but I think we're at that critical juncture in terms of development that if we don't demand it, you're probably not going to get it, so you might as well.
Yeah.
The Spanish president, prime minister, he goes by two titles, I believe.
Okay.
But let's get his...
President and prime minister.
Yeah. But preceding to this, I think around January or December, the AU Commission chair met the Sherpa, Zendango, and they were just discussing to say, before it gets busy, how do we plan around this South Africa's G20 summit to push the Africa agenda? Yeah. And I think at the apex is the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and how processing, when you talk of climate change, you talk of all of these issues, how they then advance the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Yeah.
Just a word on Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, a big ally in terms of the Palestinian question. Yeah. And you also saw a big bear hug there from President Ramaphosa, so one imagines it's because their policies on Palestine are quite aligned.
All right, you're watching SABC News. This is rolling coverage for you of the G20 Leaders Summit. For the opening session, we are seeing the leaders of various nations, leaders of delegations arriving at the hall here at the Nasrec Expo Center. And as we see there, the UAE delegation arriving there, Shaun.
I believe it's the Crown Prince. I'm just waiting for confirmation on that, but I believe it's the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. A country that has been playing a very interesting role in terms of the conflict in Sudan. So maybe they can, have a breakthrough in terms of that. The Secretary General yesterday was talking about small states that are fueling conflicts by, giving weapons to one party. The rapids, there's a lot of speculation around the UAE's involvement in the conflict in Sudan in support of the rapid support forces that have now, of course, taken control of Western Darfur. So as much as this is a development focus, G20, as much as this is about, economic stability, it's also about stopping conflicts so that we can really focus on what matters.
Doc, here's a complication. Countries such as the United Arab Emirates and those Emirate and Gulf states that depend on oil for their revenue, etc. They complicate, don't they, the conversation around how strongly do you frame your declaration around issues of moving away from fossil fuels. It becomes a negotiated.
It becomes a very negotiated thing. They have to strike the balance. I think they're much more interested to understand how we articulate this issue of climate change and all of the fossil fuels, the move to climate. I think they will like the language of just transition.
Yes.
I think it speaks well for them. It represents them well to say, as we transition, let it be just to us, to our own domestic markets, our own economic growth, and all of
and
that.
in a way, they are not so different from many African states that talk about it, that say we recognize the science of climate change, we recognize the need to decarbonize our economies, cleaner energy, but we still see a role. South Africa is certainly among those countries that say, in our energy mix, you simply cannot do away completely with fossil fuels. You might want to move to cleaner fossil fuel technologies, but at this very juncture, to say immediate cut-off is not going to be possible.
No, a quantum leap is not possible at this point. Communities depend on these mines, where we are mining coal, for example, in our case, and I think even the Gulf states as well, their communities depend on for employment and all of that.
So just before Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia that you see on your screen right now, we had Pablo Quirino, the Foreign Minister of Argentina.
Okay.
Of course, a little controversy there. Late withdrawal of the president that followed another president, and one wonders why.
Followed is really the word. Javier Milei deciding that he's also going to skip the G20 summit.
After that $20 billion loan, huh? Just ahead of those elections. Interesting times.
Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia.
Whose government also just recognized the Palestinian state.
Yeah. So there was a major shift. It's around the build-up, Shawan, before the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, that we saw a number of countries that a couple of years ago you would not have imagined that they would stake their claim and say, actually, given what's been happening in Gaza, we are actually going to pile on the pressure on Israel and we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. And at some point it sounded like, it was almost like a bluff, but actually they were dead serious. Countries such as France and others going on to then make that move.
The UK is saying we are going to the General Assembly, we are going to pronounce our recognition of the Palestinian state. And of course, as you said, Emmanuel Macron convening the other leaders to say, let's have a different posture to what is going on in the Gaza. We understand the peace agreement, 20 points peace agreement of Donald Trump, but there's an alternative too.
Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, known for her facial expressions when she's standing alongside certain politicians. I won't mention names. But yes, a key member of the G20, a key member also of the G7, I believe, and very much influential in terms of where we go in Europe and where we go in terms of the war in Ukraine. And unfortunately, one of the few women we are seeing on the red carpet, which if you want to address the SDGs and you want to address development, gender equity, goal 5 of the SDGs talks about women's empowerment and gender equity. And the push for more women leaders, whether that be in government, in the private sector, still a work in progress.
So that photo opportunity as these leaders walk the red carpet and being welcomed by the host, the president of the G20. You're seeing on your screen right now the arrival of the Angolan president, João Lorenzo, who is making his way to that reception area where he will meet up with President Cyril Ramaphosa. An interesting also story around Angola as well, around infrastructure development, the development of the Lobito corridor in as far as rail is concerned. Those multiple conversations that you can be a partner with countries to the global south, but at the same time take advantage of partnerships with the United States where they present themselves, because I saw that the US has really come to the fore quite significantly recently around the Lobito corridor that is being developed.
Yeah, but Tulas, one thing about João Lorenzo is, you remember when he came in, a lot of people were not taking him much more seriously. because they were looking at him through the eyes of the former president Dos Santos to say, will he be so much assertive? And he did. He took his time, but he was very assertive in the reconfiguration of things in Angola. But what's important is that I think his first trip in the continent was to come to South Africa. And for me, since that trip, we have been having a very good cordial relationship with Angola, South Africa, particularly around issues of the SADC. And now I think he's the chair of the AU, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So, and Lorenzo was also facilitating the resolution of the conflict, the mediation in DR Congo. Before he became the chair of. So he's a very instrumental leader as well. He's a very instrumental leader, very quiet.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, representing the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Faisal bin was recently at the White House, yes, and played, I believe, some golf with the president. Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud is the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia. Another a key country, key in the Middle East, key in terms of the Palestinian question. And they were talking about investing $1 trillion in the United States over the next decade. I wonder how many trillions they can invest in terms of beneficiation and interlinkages, infrastructure on the African continent. Certainly a country, one assumes, with deep pockets given their oil wealth. And as we watch these visuals, take a step back and just understand the logistics that are at play. The coordination that is happening between security agencies, close protection detail.
Protocol consideration.
Protocol. You just saw the president's protocol lead telling him who's coming. Sometimes.
Yeah, showing. That's a friend of yours.
Yeah, we had a really interesting discussion. I've had a few conversations with this guy, Antonio Guterres, the 9th UN Secretary General of the United Nations, the former Portuguese Prime Minister, very much a good friend of development, very much a good friend of climate justice, and in that sense,
he speaks firmly on that.
And in that sense, this is the central issue. Development is the core issue of the United Nations. And very much aligned with President Ramaphosa. Told me he was very, very happy with what President Ramaphosa has done here. And they've worked hand in glove in terms of this agenda. And so he was here at the beginning. Remember, he was at that Sherpa meeting at the beginning of the process. The Deputy Secretary General, I think, attended the Foreign Ministers meeting, the Finance Ministers meeting. The UN has been very invested in this process. And so a very key figure arriving here and will be the center of those discussions.
And why not, Doc? Because if you're saying this is a grouping that started up being about stabilization of the global economy, you can't divorce issues of development from that agenda.
And what Antonio Guterres speaks about, he's so unambiguous on many international relations. If you want to listen to him, if you want to get him very clearly, listen to his speech on Mandela Lecture. He was very clear in terms of what the Global South is, the issues that the Global South is facing, and how they need to be changed, those whole issues. And also I think one of his legacies will be the Pact for the Future, the Summit of the Future, and the Pact for the Future.
Yeah. And you're about to see the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, making his way. There he is, making his way into the venue, Hall 6 here at the Nasraq Expo Center, awaiting to receive him, President Cyril Ramaphosa, an interesting country at the nexus of Asia, Africa, Asia and the Middle East and Europe, that nexus, but also a key country within the G20 itself.
And with the mediation of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, is a very instrumental person as well, very reliable in terms of somebody to reach to help in that mediation. He's been very instrumental. So he's a very interesting figure.
Yeah, and I think a figure like that and a figure like Giorgia Meloni, and you'll see Emmanuel Macron, and you've seen the Saudis, and the list goes on. It really does speak to multipolarity. If you want a visual of what multipolarity looks like, look at the leaders arriving at the G20, right? These regional powerful countries that have influence regionally, have influence of the global stage. We tend to talk about just the superpower in the sort of overwhelming monolithic perspective. But they're very powerful countries here. They have a lot of influence and a lot of sway, and if they work together, they can do a lot. And so the question is, what is the level of consensus that one can engender with all these multipolar countries in the room?
So speaking about the issue of consensus, Doc, the point that has been made about the declaration is the declaration requires consensus. Is that possible when one of the countries is not in the room? Because
I think for you to oppose the declaration, you have to be in the room.
Yeah.
You can't oppose the declaration via tweets and social media posts. You have to be in the room. And that's been the message we've been putting out there, unambiguous.
Yeah. Li Qiang, who is the Chinese premier, who arrived representing President Xi Jinping and also being welcomed there by President Cyril Ramaphosa.
And there was so much discussion about the absence of President Xi Jinping, but he doesn't travel to a lot of multilateral events. He's often represented by the premier, which is essentially the prime minister, the head of government. I don't think it's a slight at all.
Also, Shawan, if you understand, and I'm not going to predict any succession or anything like that. The way China is run, it's no coincidence when you are deployed to these platforms. So I don't want to be understood to be talking commentary about succession, but I am saying they don't just deploy anyone to these important platforms. It says something about the standing and stature of the person within the Chinese Communist Party and broadly in Chinese society. So it's definitely not a slight at all.
Julius Maada Bio, the president of Sierra Leone, also a country on the UN Security Council right now.
Yeah.
They were affected by climate change, seriously. You remember the mudslide a few years back. So when you talk of climate change, it's issues that are very closest to him, I think, as head of state of Sierra Leone.
And a country that also understands conflict and the transition away from conflict. So very much an important role player in the silencing of the guns conversation in the 2030 Africa 2063 context as well.
Also really plugged in on issues of development financing. I attended the IDA, International Development Association replenishment event that was in Cote d'Ivoire last year, and you heard him talking quite strongly about the role of concessional financing for development, and that will be one of the key discussions in terms of the cost of capital that it costs the African continent in particular.
And he's also been a very key interlocutor in terms of Security Council reform and what the African position needs to be in terms of a future permanent configuration for African countries. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, putting on his jacket. Fully clothed as he makes the red carpet.
He made a very strong statement yesterday upon his arrival and saying that South Africa should be proud of the work that has gone in towards hosting this G20 and also talking about his full support. He said, you can count on France's support for the work that you are doing. And then when he was asked about the absence of the United States president, you could tell he really doesn't want to engage with that topic. And he said, we hope that they can on-ramp at some point. Hopefully they will re-engage because they are hosting the next one. But you could tell this is not a topic he wants to dwell on. He wants to move on. Let's move on. Let's talk with those who are in the room.
I also think he enjoys a pretty good relationship with President Trump, and so that maybe doesn't want to impugn or undermine that because they have multiple stakes in different fires, Ukraine among them. But certainly a very visible, powerful figure that isn't shy to give his position and has been a strong ally of South Africa's G20 presidency. Of course, France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so very, very influential in that regard.
The bear hug was happening again there.
No, I think a lot of these leaders actually like each other. I think they do. Look, Cyril Ramaphosa has been very effective on the international stage. I mean, I can't speak too much on the domestic front. I'm going to leave that to you to listen to. But hey, those potholes and the lights were filled in Joburg, and the traffic lights were working. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, very, very supportive of the just energy transition in South Africa, but also on the receiving end of tariffs and conversations with the United States and trying to fill a gap, I think, recognizing that they cannot no longer just depend on that long-standing alliance with the USA.
So what I've been noticing, Doc, I don't know if you've noticed it, every time there's a big issue about the United States and South Africa in some commentary, they are always almost very quick to say, we are South Africa's biggest trading partner.
Exactly.
That's happened quite a number of times, including this week.
I mean, even after the whole debacle of tariffs, I think they visited South Africa when we were speaking about how they become an alternative trading partner and expanding that trade.
Antonio Costa, the EU Council President. You're right, Doc. I think the first two leaders to arrive in South Africa, I think it was in March in Cape Town, were the two leaders you just saw walk the carpet. And that is when the beginning of the deal making around just energy transition. I think there was a $3 billion agreement that has since blossomed into an 11.3 billion euro agreement between South Africa and the EU. And the EU were the first leaders to show up after Donald Trump signed the executive order, President Trump, to deal with the White Afrikaner issue and refugees and South Africa's taking Israel to the ICJ and the like. The EU were the first to show up and to affirm South Africa's trajectory, and certainly in the development space in particular.
And so recently announcing 750 million euros in new investment in transport and energy infrastructure in South Africa. So that talks to the levels of investment and partnership.
I don't know, Shoen and Tulas, as we talk of this realignment, to what extent do we have a voice to be assertive on our own goals? As we say, okay, as they place themselves as alternative markets, to what extent do we advance the agenda of processing, beneficiation, and all of that? I don't know. It's something we seem not to be paying much attention to, but much more interested in, I think, desperation to get alternative markets without saying, okay, how do we then build our own capability at home?
I'll engage with that in just a moment, Doc. But we're seeing the leader of South Korea, Shawan, that's making his way. Recently elected president of South Korea. Just need to get the name. President Lee Jae-myung is his name. It's been a turbulent time in South Korean politics.
It is.
The ousting of the former president following an attempt to declare martial law late last year. Then you see Lee Jae-myung rising earlier on in the year, around June thereabouts. But certainly lots going on in his own country, but a key player, influential player on the global stage.
And to your question, Doc, the question is, how does Africa assert itself in this beneficiation conversation? Is it going to be about EU investing in critical minerals and beneficiating, or is it going to be African companies, private sector, playing a larger role? Are they more risk averse than our European partners? Are they more risk averse? You see bilateral deals being negotiated between countries like the United States and the DRC in relation to linking trade to conflict resolution, it appears, right? The US now playing a sort of outsized role in terms of the peace formula between Rwanda and the DRC and Eastern Congo. And then if you read between the tea leaves, we understand there's some critical mineral deals that might be in the offing. And the question is, to what extent does Africa assert itself in that process to ensure that we control the market, we control the critical, and so that we can beneficiate to the extent that China, for example, has done?
For the African countries and their leaders who are attending here, they will need no better reminder than the surroundings around Nasrec, right? You've got a lot of these mine dumps. They look better than they usually do.
They're green these days.
Some vegetation is growing and some trees you see there. But it doesn't take away, detract from what they symbolize, right? Extraction without beneficiation. So you extract and you leave a mound of soil, you leave a hole in the ground. This is a different mining and minerals conversation that Africa is looking to have, certainly as we talk about the critical minerals, quite apart from the rare earths, but related. Rare earths, critical minerals, how do you handle it differently such that it leads to industrialization of African countries? South Africa certainly put that on the agenda during its G20 presidency. How do you leverage off that at the same time and just change the dynamic of how the mineral endowment has played itself out in the recent past.
You know Ambassador Nozipho Mxakato Diseko, right? She was chair of a panel instituted by the Secretary General to come up with a blueprint to how to manage the glut for critical minerals. It's there.
Yeah.
Let's implement it. Let's take the ideas. There are lots of recommendations in that report. It spells out how to ensure that Africa retains control here. So let's stop, prophesying and speculating about what needs to be done. Sometimes the plan is there. We should read it and implement it, guys.
Exactly. And the issue of illicit financial flows.
Yeah. That also comes into the
88.6 million, according to a report of billion US dollars, according to a report of former Minister Trevor Manuel. That's a lot of money that could go into the development of the continent.
Yeah. And before Trevor Manuel was President Mbeki.
President Mbeki.
Yeah. Right?
What kinds of institutional architectures do we build? Because building that institutional architecture at home, at the national level, it's not so much helpful. Because this outflows happens
it is international.
At a regional, continental.
By its very nature, it's international.
It's international.
Yeah.
So we need the institutional architecture both at all levels, so that we cap these outflows.
Yeah. So that's part of the conversations. The anti-corruption work has been part of the work, the various work streams and conversations that have been happening during the G20 presidency of South Africa, as well as that international architecture just reshaping global governance and the various institutions that are responsible for global governance, especially in the area of finance, better regulation of the markets, for example, ensuring that while you are allowing markets to thrive, there is a level of regulation that ensures that you never really end up with a situation almost similar to 2008. Yeah.
And as we continue to monitor the live feed of the arrivals of heads of state and government, I mean, we're very close to President Ramaphosa, the G20 president's opening address here. That'll be essentially the opening session before they go into closed session to get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
And understand, the word that we perhaps haven't used enough in this conversation is multilateralism and the importance of multilateralism.
Yes.
And when you have the AU Commission Chair and the UN Secretary General and all these world leaders, the big takeaway, I think, is that there is a broad recognition here that you don't achieve the requisite results, the results at scale, if you go it alone.
Yeah.
And sorry.
No, please, no.
I'm saying, I just wanted to add and say, this is why then you see the significance of Antonio Guterres here, to center the centrality of the realization of the centrality of multilateral institutions, particularly the UN, to say, you can have your G20 discussions, guys, but remember, there is a multilateral organization that is very important, that has set a global agenda, that you must play a role in achieving that global agenda.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's almost, as these things are, they're a bit complex as well. We all know what the goals are that we want to achieve, the sustainable development goals, etc. But how much do you emphasize that in the declaration such as the one you are hoping to reach within the G20? I understand that's one of the conversations that comes up that says, are you really going to center the SDGs in this final declaration? Yes, we all agree that's where we are going, but in terms of how we get there, are you going to then spell that out? Then it becomes a negotiation of the level at which you emphasize that in a declaration such as the one they are seeking to finalize here.
And a mechanism like a Paris Agreement, you know why Paris Agreement is a problematic issue? It is specific in terms of the implementation of how to do all of these things to realize the goal of mitigating against climate change. It's very specific. Curb your carbon emissions to this rate, do this and all of that. So that's why it's so much complicated. It has been politicized because it's very clear. So as the resolutions come in, the declaration come in, that clarity as well of mechanisms of implementation.
We believe this is the Vice President of Nigeria?
Yeah. Nigeria, one of the countries invited to come and be part of this G20 Leaders Summit by invitation, one of the many African countries that have been invited to be a part of the conversations. In fact, you have other institutions as well. Wamgele Mene is here as well from the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also the various institutions, the African Development Bank as well, also being part of. In fact, Nigeria was meant to be represented by the president,
Right.
Bola Tinubu, but events back at home dictated that he really can't. The abduction of 24 schoolgirls, meaning that they had to reconfigure their level of
Which again, to re-emphasize, is par for the course, right? I mean, heads of state have multiple responsibilities, and sometimes domestic issues, as I've been saying, proliferate and dominate. I would be surprised. Would it be a failure if the SDGs are not central in this document? It's all we've been talking about. If the development agenda is not central, that would be a failure, I think, for certainly the momentum we've seen building since Indonesia, taken on by India, Brazil, and now South Africa. So it kind of has to be there.
You know what it is?
What are we doing?
You know what it is? SDGs by any other name.
Right.
Sometimes you don't want to say SDGs,
Yes.
but then when you put content to it, and I've recognized that, Sherwin, by the way, when we're talking about inequality, the report that is going to be presented by Professor Joseph Stiglitz and his team talks to inequality, the causes of income inequality, etc. What are we talking about? Are we not talking about SDGs without calling them SDGs?
You see?
It's all. I mean, what's so controversial about an agenda that seeks to lift the poor out of poverty and lift the crime, those facing climate catastrophe out of that catastrophe? What is so controversial about solidarity, sustainability, equality? What is wrong with
its interest? That's what it is.
No, but also, I mean, you're trying to address problems, right? When you talk about, it should be meritocracy, we are trying to address an generational curse that has followed women for such a long time and seeking to create more of a balance. But in addition to the SDGs, part of this whole development conversation has to be a recognition of what we are going to do in terms of artificial intelligence. So as much as you are saying, we need to get these raw minerals out, these critical minerals for communications technologies, for data centers, for robotics, for electric cars, and the list goes on and it's becoming more and more expansive. What is that going to mean for the human workforce moving forward? Are we thinking, we can't just think about what we're going to get out of the ground and how we're going to beneficiate. Yes, that's one element, but what are the job losses going to be from the end product of those minerals?
Yes. Apologies. I want to take advantage of your better eyesight than mine. So
that's the plenary room.
that's inside, our first look inside the plenary room.
That is the first look,
And we're seeing how it's all decked out, the flags somewhere in the background. And is it shaped almost in a round table?
I think it's a round table.
It's a round table kind of setup, And that communicates something as well in terms of, we are all in this together. There isn't a head of the table, an all-knowing head of the table. We are all, it's a common approach. All views are valued just in terms of the aesthetics and how it's all set up.
I mean, it's also an engineering and architectural decision. If you have a circle, you can all see each other. So if you're sitting at a long table, you're going to have to lean over each other. So it's a practical thing, but I think the symbolism, you hit it on the head.
That's why I wanted you next to me.
Have you ever been to dinner where you're sitting, where there's 6 of you and it's a square table and you're like, no, you have to lean forward. A round table, 6 is perfect. It's perfect.
Absolutely.
Zane Dango. Can we give a nod to Zane Dango?
He handled the whole thing.
Zane Dango.
He's been meaning this thing from the word go since it was announced. He's been running this thing from
diligently.
Yeah. And I wanted to also tap into your eye for detail, Sherwin.
Given your eyesight. No, I understand. I
was also fascinated by the ceiling. There you are. What does that look like? What's happening there?
Looks like the Star Trek Enterprise.
That's what I was saying.
I mean, this is a ship that's about to take off to go where no man has ever gone before.
There's nothing wrong with
the question, though, becomes, will we be going at warp speed? Scotty? Engage.
I thought I was seeing things, Sherwin. But it's an
I just need to find out, where's Captain Kirk? That's going to be President Ramaphosa, right? Yeah, there we go. Beam me up, Scotty. Yeah, right, there we go.
And there's a protocol to the sitting arrangement.
Yeah.
You don't just sit and...
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, no, you got to go and sit where your name tag is.
Absolutely.
And then your foreign minister and your delegation sits behind. I mean, there are lots of people here. I mean, a president doesn't just come by themselves.
Absolutely.
So there's an economic benefit here as well, right? I mean, I think these delegations are paying for their own hotel bills. They're probably going to, some of them will go away on a vacation in South Africa. So there's an economic impetus. It'd be interesting to hear from Patricia de Lille, the Minister of Tourism, about what... this is the Emir of Qatar. The Emir of Qatar, also a country that has punched above its weight in terms of Gaza, the war in Gaza. getting his...
It is Emir of Qatar, Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who is being welcomed there by President Cyril Ramaphosa.
A country that also was bombed by Israel.
It was.
And received an apology subsequently from the Israeli Prime Minister in that regard. It was mediated by President Donald Trump. So let's give credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
That realignment is very interesting because a few years ago, Qatar was not so much in good terms with the US.
Seen as a supporter of the terrorist group Hamas.
Exactly.
That's how the US frames the militant group.
Exactly.
And a country that has given President Trump an aeroplane, if my memory serves me correctly, which was the subject matter of President Ramaphosa's bilateral with the president when they opened to questions.
But
that
it was
the
a
conversation that dominated. The plane. And then President Ramaphosa said, if I had a plane, I will give you the plane.
Yeah,
but,
it was a good icebreaker.
Unfortunately, I don't have a plane to give.
He can give him Kwazi. Apparently that needs a lot of repairs, right?
I mean, the president waiting there also is a powerful picture on its own because he really is center stage. His leadership on the global stage, as you were saying, Shawan, that it will be subject of much analysis, but it will be written in indelible ink that in the year 2025, he chaired and presided over South Africa's presidency of the G20, and this summit, this historic summit, will be written in indelible ink in the history books that it happened on the African continent, a leaders summit of the G20. It would be icing on the cake for him if it emerges with a declaration.
Yes, it will. Definitely.
But even if it ends up being a chairperson's statement, it will be criticized and analyzed and critiqued for just how powerful it will be in terms of the key issues that South Africa has sought to put at the center of the agenda of the G20.
It is historic to us. The agenda itself, the agenda setting itself, it is very historic. That you didn't only convene the G20, but you determine the agenda. Remember, for the longest time, we've been crying that we're not on the tables, we're not on the Security Council, we're marginalized and all of that. So for the first time, we're hosting this powerful organization here of states, and we're setting the agenda. We're not just hosting it, but the agenda setting is coming from us.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi arriving on the red carpet, power block in and of itself. Also, in terms of the resolution of the Ukraine war, the threats of secondary sanctions from the United States in terms of India's purchasing of Russian oil, the alliance between India and China that could become such a powerful bloc in the context of America's disassociation from multilateralism.
Listen, he's been quite enthusiastic of his participation as the Indian Prime Minister about his participation in the G20 in South Africa and actually sees South Africa's presidency as building up from the presidency of India in 2023 and is particularly proud of the fact that the African Union became a member of the G20 during India's presidency.
Right, and South Africa would have been part of a troika with an India, Brazil, and South Africa, not so?
Yeah.
In terms
when India was there.
So South Africa would have been in the troika if India was. So if India.
When Brazil was
president,
South Africa was in the troika.
When Brazil was in the middle,
India.
India was to the left, and South Africa was to the right.
And now the troika is rearranged.
So don't underestimate the bonds and the relationship that has been formed in terms of this transition from Indonesia. And so they've worked very closely on this agenda. They've built on. Sequentially on the agenda. And so it's very much important for them to solidify what it is they've been working on for the last 4 years, because you know that the troika is going to soon include the United States, where the position will shift, the agenda will shift away from this development focus. And so how the other countries in this G20 implement what is agreed to here will be important. So when we talk about, an outcome document, whether you have consensus or not, the countries that want to implement it are going to implement it.
The troika changes, by the way, Shawan. It now becomes South Africa, United States, United Kingdom.
I like how you're building on what I've just taught you. Very good. Very good, Silas. You're learning fast, my brother.
Very interesting.
Nothing has changed, Shaun. I still got you. All those years in New York, I still got you.
No, very good.
We were talking earlier on about the opportunities for bilaterals. One of the bilaterals that the Indian Prime Minister was looking forward to is with Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister. There was a bit of anticipation. So this is what we are talking about, that this is an opportunity. Yes, you dot your I's and cross the T's as far as the declaration or whatever statement comes out of Johannesburg 2025, but you don't miss an opportunity to say the global architecture is changing, global trade is being upended, let's talk. How do we advance trade between ourselves? And that's the spirit in which you are seeing the conversations with the EU and their announcement that 750 million euro announcement in investment in infrastructure and transport in South Africa, the replenishment of the Global Fund, and all of these other sub-meetings that are happening on the sidelines as well.
No, it's true, Tulas. As we were saying earlier on, the realignment is not only happening at the superpowers, but even the middle powers are now coming up. They are playing a major role that normally is played by the superpowers. Some states are very conservative about how they play that role, but sometimes it's a very instrumental role they play. In whether you look at the Gaza-Palestinian issue, you look at the UAE in the continent in terms of peace and security, Sudan, where almost AU has no voice there, the SADC, all the regional organizations that don't seem to be understanding how to get that melting pot right in Sudan. So the middle powers, the role of the middle powers becomes very important.
Dr. Lakabe, let me ask you a question about how you feel South Africa has managed this process. I mean, I've seen a little bit of them at their diplomats at work when they come to the United Nations. They had a G20 foreign ministers meeting on the sidelines of the General Assembly in September. And I was very impressed at the work ethic. These guys were punching all day, all night, working really hard, trying to really put South Africa's best foot forward. I wonder what you've seen from your perspective.
No, from my perspective, and as we were talking earlier on about Zain Dango, how he has steered the ship, how he has kept the whole discussion focused. You remember the first finance summit of ministers summit where the US was absent, but the summit continued. It went to make a declaration. There was coherence, and all the working groups, how they went on to discuss, very focused. The work has been done, 100 meetings, as we hear, or more than 100 meetings that have taken place, various working groups and all of that. So it's a tough thing to organize. I mean, looking at the working groups, both in the finance and in the Sherpa track. But I think South Africa has done well in terms of managing this. And as we were saying, I think Zain deserves to be given, as you always say here at home, he needs to get his roses. No, he has done wonderfully.
I thought you were going to say, as we say here at home, no one deserves a December more than the Sherpa.
I wonder what his bonus looks like, though. I wonder what his bonus looks like.
But then again, Doc, it comes back to, and I like to relate the story. I don't mind repeating it many times, so those who've heard it will forgive me. The origin of the word Sherpa, Shaun.
Yes.
Because it's quite symbolic, coming as it does from the Himalayan region, the people that assist mountaineers to get to the top of
the mountain.
They guide you. We help you. We are your Sherpas. This process sometimes can feel like an uphill battle when there's a point of contention where you see people appear to be poles apart, and it's up to you to say, okay, we will remove that adjective there. Does that work?
Yeah.
We'll put a full stop after that word. Does it change anything for you? And you sort of negotiate it that way.
The President walking through the plenary alongside EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And if that image doesn't tell you something, we've spoken to that earlier today, this is a bond. They've shown up a few times this year in South Africa, the EU Commission President and the EU Council President. And I wonder if she's going to be sitting alongside President Ramaphosa.
Yeah, I read a statement on social media, Shaun and Doc, that said the EU loves them, they are South Africa, and if they could help it, South Africa would be an honorary member of the European Union. But that's just making light of the necessary realignment that you've been talking to, Doc, that says where a gap has opened up. And it's not just about a gap as well, it's about historically the trade ties that have been there over a period of time, building up those trade ties, opening up markets for South African products, EU from countries from the EU, companies investing in South Africa. That builds over a period of time such that the stakes are high for all of us to maintain that relationship.
And who's sitting right behind the president? I think there's a chair that is empty. So that, normally the foreign... No, it's Zane Dangle. It's Zane Dangle. So the Sherpa, the guide, is sitting right behind the president.
The guide of the whole...
The World Health Organization Director General, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. Of course, quality healthcare, pandemic responsiveness,
Vaccine
also very important.
Nationalism. Vaccine imperialism. Very outspoken on that.
And of course, he took center stage a couple of years ago in his own way during the response to the global pandemic. But also you saw the G20 having to step up and respond to that. All of those issues, the inadequate and unequal access to vaccines became a key intervention of the G20 to say, how can we address this? What can we do in our different countries to advance access to vaccines? And not only has it been at that level, you're now seeing conversations about investment, for instance, of countries in the EU in vaccine manufacture.
Namibia's president.
Yeah, Nandi Ndaitwah Netumbo, recently elected president of Namibia, one of the many African heads of state and government who have been invited. Joao Lorenzo of Angola also here, the president of Equatorial Guinea. We saw him a bit earlier on, also arriving at this summit.
Interesting with Namibia is that they were organizing the Pact for a Summit for the Future with Germany.
That's right, they were co-facilitators.
They were co-facilitating there. And it was quite interesting that it's Germany and Namibia.
Right, given the colonial history.
Given the colonial history, setting the global agenda, facilitated that whole thing.
Dr. Lekaba, tell me what the president is going to say in this opening address. What do you expect to hear from him now? This is his moment in the sun. The world's leaders will be watching. Their channels back home will be focused on his opening remarks. What do you expect to hear from the president? Quite imminently.
Yeah, I think he's going to remind global leaders that this is G20 and this is G20 Summit. And G20 has a central role to play in all global challenges, in realizing the global agenda. I think he's going to start by reminding the leaders of that, so that he centers the focus on the work of the G20. Because if he doesn't do that, what will justify the declaration? But if you center the importance of G20 and giving a history as to why we got to formulate this group of 20, and it had to move all the years, and 2008, why the leaders were now brought in. Remember, it was finance and governance. So why the leaders were brought in and all of that. So it is a reminder to say, guys, we have a serious role to play here. Our decision making is very important. And all. So I think he's going to take that advantage to say, as a way to say, let's agree on the declaration.
Also remember, he's got a dashboard view with the help of the Sherpa, that how is it going in the various working groups that you've had, the 15 thematic working groups. How are we doing in terms of finding common ground? How close are we in terms of the positions? How easily can we translate the draft declaration into a final G20 Leaders Summit declaration? So you can expect that he will seek to talk to all of that. I do expect, Sherwin, that informed by the report on inequality that he commissioned, he will want to infuse some of that into it. But also South Africa, quite clear that its presidency of the G20 was not just about South Africa, but the global South, and in particular Africa. So issues around debt sustainability, I do expect that he will talk to those, also informed by the Africa panel of experts who will also present their report during one of the sessions today.
Before I flew to South Africa, I interviewed Professor Gayatri Ghosh. She's a member of Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the extraordinary committee on wealth inequality. And one of my questions to her was, what happens to the agenda when the United States comes in? because they've already asserted that they don't want to embrace the development conscious perspective that South Africa has infused in this process. And she said it's going to be, countries are going to have to go around the United States. The UK has already indicated that they will sort of pick up where South Africa left off. And so if you need to do a wide berth on what the US presents, and look, the US might not disassociate from everything. They will do it from an America First perspective. If there is a benefit to the American population, to the American economy, one imagines that they will engage. But certainly, I'm trying to remember the word she used to describe it. I think she suggested that there would be a loss of relevance for the G20 if they ignored development. And so very important for them to stay relevant in the sense, you know.
And there's a reason for that, why issues of development were infused, isn't there, Doc? Because when you were purely focused on economics and the global economy, stabilization, markets and the likes, it became quite clear that the conversation doesn't go forward when you have these other issues that impact on economies that are of relevance and significance in various regions. So if those economies are not firing because they're being held back by developmental issues, because they are battling with debt, which means that they're spending more on debt servicing than they're spending on developmental programs, if they're being saddled with issues of the climate conditions and climate change, the global economy as a whole is not moving forward in the way that you want. These are intertwined, inseparable.
And when you look at our theme, of course we've got sustainability, equality and all of that, but the emphasis on inequality, I think, it's what is extremely important here, because everything flows. And this is when you look at the report, they center that issue of inequality to say sustainability is because of inequality. The reason why we talk of just energy transition and why the transition must be just to some of us is because we are unequal. How in terms of our GDPs and all of that, in terms of even our own development, we are unequal. So we can't all of us do a quantum leap. For you, it will not be a quantum leap in terms of the transition, but for us, it will be a major transformation. So that theme of inequality, it's like a golden thread of what the South African theme is all about.
If you've just joined us, welcome to SABC News' rolling coverage. We are sitting in studio here at the Media Centre at the Johannesburg Expo Precinct, known formerly as Nasrec, and alongside us is the plenary you have on your screen right now. World leaders, members of the G20, invited guests have gathered for deliberations. The Leaders Summit underway here in Johannesburg, South Africa. There, a picture of the UN Secretary General, a man that will be at the center of discussions when you talk about climate transition, climate justice, disaster resilience, because we know that development is going to be key to how the global economy moves forward. Key role players in the room. We are awaiting the opening address that will be open to the public, to our viewers. From G20 President and South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. We are running about 30-something minutes late. He was due to do the opening address at around 10 a.m. Central African time. They look like they're gearing up towards that opening address. He is raising his hands in prayer or in supplication, asking leaders to take their seats, one imagines. Soon we'll be underway. And I'm very curious to hear how the president frames this meeting.
And also, Shawan, I mean, you will have gone into rooms like these in the past for a photo op. For us, it would have been a photo op. This is the point at which these are leaders who know each other, who interact almost on a regular basis, sometimes putting a call through that then has a read through of, the president of this country called that president and they had a discussion. So it's kind of hard, I imagine.
But you know how it is. When you don't see someone, you know someone for a long time. You see them for the first time in a while. You give them time to catch up.
Absolutely.
So that's what's happening now. They're all smiles. They're all backslapping. The President, Ramaphosa, let's take you live inside the plenary.
Of regional economic communities, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, all guests who are gathered here. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome you as South Africa to this very first G20 Leaders Summit to be held on African soil. We gather here at the cradle of humanity in Africa to affirm our common humanity. We gather here to affirm the value of partnership and cooperation to finding common solutions to shared problems. Shortly before the dawn of democracy in South Africa, the father of our democracy, Nelson Mandela, said, "The time has come for South Africa to take up its rightful and responsible place in the community of nations." Today, as we open this G20 Leaders Summit, South Africa is deeply aware of the profound responsibility that membership of the community of nations places upon us. We also understand the responsibility of being entrusted with the presidency of the G20. In the execution of its task as president of the G20, South Africa has, throughout the past year, through its stewardship of some 130 meetings in various parts of South Africa, in other countries on the African continent, and beyond our shores, including at the United Nations, we have sought to undertake this task with care, with dignity, and with diligence. We have sought at all times to preserve the integrity and the stature of the G20, a premier forum of international economic cooperation. From its initial focus on broad macroeconomic issues, the G20 is now engaged on matters such as trade, sustainable development, health, education, science and technology, agriculture, energy, the environment, climate change, and many others. It has therefore broadened its scope as the challenges of the peoples of the world requires that they should be addressed. As the G20 countries, we understand that progress on each and all of these issues is a necessary condition for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. In pursuit of and in conformity with the founding mission of the G20, South Africa adopted the theme Solidarity, Equality, and Sustainability for its presidency in 2025. Through solidarity, we can create an inclusive future that advances the interests of people around the world who are at the greatest risk of being left behind. This is important in an interconnected world where the challenge faced by one nation affects all other nations. By promoting equality, we strive to ensure fair treatment and equal opportunities for the individuals and nations of the world. The disparities in wealth and development within and between nations is not only unjust and unsustainable, it is also one of the greatest impediments to sustainable development. It is essential that we break down divisions of economic status, of gender, of race, and geography. Sustainability involves meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. As a founding member of the G20, South Africa has sought to ensure that the development priorities of the Global South and the African continent find expression firmly and permanently on the agenda of the G20. This is important not only for the people of Africa and the Global South. It is vital for global stability and security, alleviating resource pressures, managing population movements, and reducing the risk of conflict. We seek stability because it attracts investment, it improves planning and reduces the risk of global economic shocks. And we prioritize inclusive and vibrant markets because they are able to drive innovation and efficiency. Thriving economies lift people out of poverty. They encourage greater investment and trade, and they generate the revenue needed to invest in public goods. The threats facing humanity today, from escalating geopolitical tensions, global warming, pandemics, energy and food insecurity, to inequality, unemployment, extreme poverty, and armed conflict, jeopardize our collective future. It is therefore essential that we make greater and faster progress towards the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We welcome the Seville Commitment adopted in June this year, which sets forth a renewed global framework for financing for development. We must use this framework to catalyze development investments at scale in developing economy countries. We must continue the reform of the international financial architecture, ensuring that institutions are strengthened and are more inclusive and are equipped to meet the challenges both of the present and the future. At the beginning of our G20 presidency, we identified 4 high-level priorities. Firstly, we focus on action to strengthen disaster resilience and response. While climate-induced natural disasters affect countries around the world, they have a particularly devastating impact on countries that cannot afford the costs of recovery and rebuilding. We have agreed that it is essential for the global community, international finance institutions, development banks, and the private sector to scale up post-disaster construction. Secondly, we agreed that we must take action to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries. The G20 needs to renew its efforts to advance debt sustainability while at the same time laying emphasis on those countries in the Global South that are suffering from debt repayments. Thirdly, we said we should mobilize finance for a just energy transition, increasing the quality and quantity of climate finance flows to developing economy countries. Fourthly, we emphasized the importance of harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development through the beneficiation of the minerals at the place of extraction. In addition to these 4 priorities, we have prioritized issues of inclusive economic growth, industrialization, inequality, unemployment, and security and artificial intelligence. Much of the work of the past year will be presented and considered at this meeting. we commend in particular the G20 at 20 review, which provides a detailed account of the path that this organization has traversed as the G20. It describes both our achievements and our challenges and makes proposals on how we can organize ourselves to be more focused on our core mandate. We welcome the work of the G20 Africa Expert Panel, which was led by South Africa's former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel. The panel argues that African efforts to accelerate productive investment require new global partnerships and strong multilateral cooperation. It calls on the G20 to support this effort by building a global policy framework that unlocks long-term finance and lower costs and investment at scale. We are also grateful for the work of the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality that was led by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate. The recommendations of the Extraordinary Committee provide a solid platform on which to launch a renewed global effort to tackle inequality. As this is the first G20 Leaders Summit to be held in Africa, it carries the hopes and must reflect the aspirations of the people of this continent and of the world. We should not allow anything to diminish the value, the stature, and the impact of the first African G20 presidency. This G20 Leaders Summit has a responsibility not to allow the integrity and the credibility of the G20 to be weakened. In fact, from this summit, we should have a sense that the G20 has been strengthened. We thank all delegations that have worked together with us in good faith to produce a worthy G20 outcome document for this historic leaders meeting. The G20 underscores the value of the relevance of multilateralism. It recognizes that the challenges that we face can only be resolved through cooperation, collaboration, and partnership. The adoption of the declaration from the summit sends an important signal to the world that multilateralism can and does deliver. It sends a message of hope and solidarity across the world. It tells the world that as the leaders of the G20, we will keep fast to our solemn pledge to leave no person, no community, and no country behind. With those words, I therefore declare the G20 Leaders Summit open, and thank you. Your Excellencies, please allow me to take you through day one of the program. Session one will focus on inclusive and sustainable economic growth. This session will be followed by presentations of the recommendations of the reports of the Africa Expert Panel and the Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality. We will then have a working lunch, and this will be followed by a right at the beginning, is to execute the task that we have come here for principally, which is by overwhelming consensus to adopt our declaration. Now, I should precede this by remembering what a Roman philosopher called Pliny, the elder, once said. He said to have said, ex Africa semper aliquid novi, meaning out of Africa there is always something new. So something new always does come out of Africa. So with that, we would like, therefore, okay. I'm told that the cameras are still on, they should be off. I don't know why that is so. With that, we would like, therefore, with the consensus that has emerged through the work that has been done over the whole year and the 130 meetings that have been held where each sector has been able to reach agreement, would like, therefore, to put the proposal.
Before the mics could be cut, swiftly moving to say what I suppose was not supposed to be said with us in the room. And we've been joined by John Curtin, Director of G7 and G20 research groups, to weigh in on all of these conversations. But we can't unhear what we've heard.
So let me quickly jump in. I think they're about to adopt a declaration based on what the president said there. So that in and of itself is a little bit of a mic drop, if you will, excuse the pun, given the fact that there's been so much consternation about whether we would get to a declaration, whether there would be some objections, whether the Americans or the Argentinians would put a spanner in the works. And it looks like that he was moving towards some sort of broad consensus in terms of the adoption of that. Let me hand over to you.
It's great news. There will be a declaration, even though Mr. Trump, the U.S., said no. All the rest of the G20 said go, and go from the beginning. So now the leaders don't have to worry about, fixing this adjective or not. They can speak person to person, freely and frankly, about all the really big things they need to do, and they can do more than what's already in the declaration.
And no, it's not just a declaration, because as I said, we can't unhear what we've heard already, right? So there are protocols and rules. He was supposed to deliver his opening address, and then the rest was going to take place behind closed doors. But in that gap where he started speaking to what was supposed to be behind closed doors, we heard more than enough. So it's a declaration, not just a declaration by it's a declaration by overwhelming consensus. And he was getting to the point, Sharon, before we had to cut out of it, out of Africa, there's always something new, that quotation that he was using. I suppose he's talking to, let's dispense with it. The declaration is by overwhelming consensus. We'll then get to the journey, how we got here and all the other details, but make no mistake, there is a declaration. It's by overwhelming consensus.
Right, and that's a declaration about a vision, right? The vision is the declaration, and then I suppose they're going to discuss the means of implementation and how we get there. But remember how he prefaced that moment. He said things like, we should not allow anything to diminish the impact of the first Africa G20. I wonder what he was talking about there. He talked about the credibility and the integrity of the G20 should not be diminished. The G20 should underscore its relevance, the relevance of multilateralism, exactly what we were talking about. The representation of the United Nations there, the African Union there. He thanked delegations for the outcome document. So he was heading in a direction. We must signal that multilateralism does deliver. keep fast to the solemn pledge, which is also contained in the 2030 development agenda, to not leave anyone behind. And then he moved to adopting the declaration, John Curtin.
Yes, indeed. Nothing, he said from the start of our presidency right up to now, should diminish, as you said, the status, the stature, the integrity, the credibility of the G20, which is uniquely a leaders level summit. So that was the clearest message to the White House, I think, that could be said, and indeed to all of the other leaders who have skipped this summit. We're back on track. And I just add one more thing. He also told us a clear signal about what will be in the declaration.
Yes.
He used the word climate change, climate, again and again. The U.S. had said no. All the rest of the G20 said go. Gender equality, the Argentinians said no. All the rest of the G20 said go. All the rest of the G20 here at the table in particular, we're backing Africa, we're backing South Africa, because we believe in it, and we've seen the great things that have come out of Africa. Nelson Mandela and that great
I'm loving
revolution.
your energy, John Curtin. I'm loving your energy and the gestures that you are using. Very emphatic, Sherwin, as you can see, in terms of what we've seen. It's quite extraordinary. Do stay with us. Our coverage of the G20 continues for you live here at the Nasrec Expo Center. We're coming back in just a moment.